Good morning, everybody. We are the cultural choir from Aracy State School, and we have 3 songs we're going to sing for you. Hope you enjoy them. Yellow.
Guys, thank you so much. Wonderful job. Thank you. It's a pleasure. And they turn around and say, thank you for having us. Well, pretty big shoes to fill after that for the rest of our speakers. A highlight already, I would have thought. Thank you. That's Harrisfield State School Choir. Just wonderful. Just a reminder, that suggestion box I mentioned, I'll make some time this afternoon for you to fill out any idea or feedback that you have, an idea that you think the rest of us can run with. You needn't say who it's from. You can if you would like. That's entirely up to you. But we'd love if you could add your wisdom to the box by the time we leave this afternoon. Let's move straight on now to Jill Calvert, the co-chair of the Nest, our national strategy for children's wellbeing. And I guess that's what we're here to talk about today, isn't it? Children's wellbeing. Please put your hands together for Jill Calvert.
Oh, okay, great. Can I say thank you very much for inviting me here today, and what a fabulous opportunity it is to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, which is children and young people's wellbeing. But first of all, I do want to acknowledge that we stand on the land of the traditional owners, and I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders both past and present. And when I say pay my respects, I do deeply mean pay my respects, because we're standing on the land of a people who have been able to survive for over 50,000 years in a continuous living culture. And a group of people who can do that, I think, know a lot about how to look after their children and how to build a nest for their children so that their children can go strong and pass on that culture. So I do think it is really important that we really pay true and deep respect to the traditional owners of this land on which we meet. And that, I guess, the Nest is about building a nest, building something that our children and young people will grow our children and young people so that they can themselves grow up and have children and young people and grow their children and young people. And it came about because Aracy looked around in a sense and understood that we did not have a common concerted effort, a joint effort, one that we could all come together on and say, this is what we want for our children. This is the sort of place we want Australia to be, in which we can grow up our children. These are the sorts of things that we think will contribute to growing up our children. And so got together a group of people who have been now, I guess, meeting for over 3 or 4 years. And if I can just find the slide, I will skip through a lot of them because we're... I'll come back to that. Here we go. Who came together, as you can see, in 2010. We had a workshop. We agreed on a process for developing the Nest. We then put that process in place. It involved a public consultation with over 4,000 people, including children and young people. It also involved a consultation with 200 experts and Aracy members at the summit. Some of you might have been here. I hope some of you have contributed to the development of the Nest. And then more recently, we've had a release of the report card based on the framework that the Nest developed. We looked at some reviews of how we might address our priority areas. We certainly have looked at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander components of the Nest and released a draft action agenda. But I just want to go back, this is going to test my skills, to say, well, why do we need the Nest? For me, it looks like it just felt really obvious. It's a way, it's a pathway for us, it's a roadway, it's a map for us to look at how we might build our good nest for Australian children. But let's look, the stats, OECD comparisons, we're middle ranked, but we do know the cost of early childhood vulnerability, $2 trillion. We have in Australia had some success in some areas, but we've got an increase in complex conditions happening. We don't use evidence very well in Australia, and there is a lack of evidence as well. Campbell collaboration, 1% of government-funded interventions are evidence-based. Just think about that, 1% of what the government is doing is evidence-based. And even though it's difficult to progress evidence-based policy, that's not a reason to abandon it. And so we've really tried to make that one of the driving principles of the nest, that what we do to try and build a good nest for Australian children is that it has an evidence base. Another reason why we thought the nest was needed was that there's a distinct lack of focus on prevention. We're always at the pointy end in Australia. Now, we're not alone in the world in that, but in Australia we are very much at the pointy end, and so we really need to reshape that. We need to get back a focus on prevention, and we felt the nest was one way we could do that. There are gaps in existing efforts, and I'm not going to go into those because we all know them, but we have missed out on some age groups. We often don't focus on building capacity, so there are some gaps that we need to address that we thought the nest could also address as well. It's too top-down. We don't co-design, we don't co-produce very well in Australia. So again, in doing the nest, we wanted to co-design and co-produce and start modelling some of that. And in implementing some of the ideas in the nest, we wanted to also promote co-design. And we also thought that in Australia there was a bit of a focus on government solving everything. And we felt that when it comes to raising children, while they have a vital and important role, they're not the only players, and that we need to, in fact, broaden the base and the commitment of trying to sort of work through what it is we do for our children in Australia. So, following the consultations, as I said, we've produced a number of things in Aracy. That's the report card. You can get that on the web. I'm conscious of time. That's the only thing. But importantly, what we've come up with is a number of priority areas that we think will make a difference to the wellbeing of children and will help us build a better nest for our children. And you've got some of those up there: improving early childhood and learning, the educational performance, physical health, importantly, reducing disadvantage arising from income disparity. We think that if we can get some collective effort and if we can get some evidence-based interventions that will go to achieving those things, then we will see an improvement in the wellbeing of children in Australia, and we will have built a better nest for our children. We have a number of operational principles that underpin what we do. The child, a commitment to the child at the centre. And really that's because if we lose sight of the child, we lose sight of the reason why we're here. We're not here to give ourselves jobs. We're not here because we like to work with systems. We're here because we actually want to make a difference to children. So it's really important that we keep children at the centre. We also have a commitment to privileging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge. They've managed to keep their culture alive for 50,000 years. They clearly know something. So it is important that we privilege their knowledge. A long-term evidence-informed approach. We want to get from that 1% of programs being evidence-informed to a slightly higher figure. A commitment to prevention and early intervention. You know, I remember my mother saying to me, "Jill, a stitch in time saves 9." And she was right. And that's what we need to start doing with our children. We also have a commitment to a life stage approach. We don't want intergenerational warfare breaking out in Australia, despite the temptation to do that in the light of some of the current budget decisions. But it is important that we recognise that everybody has an involvement in building the nest for Australia's children. And we also have a commitment to systemic change, not just individual or programmatic change, but to systemic change which focuses on outcomes and results. And that just as an example of some of the strategies. So where are we currently using the nest? Well, we have a roundtable with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are trying to develop the Aboriginal component somewhat more. We have a research roundtable, important if we're going to look at evidence-informed policy and practice. We're developing a database about what works for kids that hopefully will become available, so you can go in and find the programs that will work for what it is you're trying to solve, if they exist. And we're also promoting local grassroots action through there. In the future, we want to build capacity to assist organisations implement the nest and to take up some of the principles of the nest. We also want to try and align some of our policies and targets to fit with this frame that we've created with the nest. Just trying to think what I've got else here. I won't go into that. Yep. So, the nest. It's what we're here doing today. We're doing an important component of the nest today because we're looking at research, we're looking at how well our kids are faring. When we start to ask questions about how well they're faring in Queensland, we have to start asking, what are we going to do about trying to change some of the information that we get? And how do we maintain those things that in fact show that we're doing well? Because it's not always just about building and repairing gaps. It is also about maintaining what it is that we've got that we think works and is effective. Download the nest, keep up to date with it, and I guess more importantly, what I'd like to do is to invite you to really take on the messages, the concept, the idea of a nest, the idea of coming together, all of us who are concerned about children and young people, coming together and really saying, as a country, or as a family, or as a community, as a town, how are we going to build a nest for our children and young people so they grow up strong, safe, healthy and happy? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jill. And one sentence really struck with me, and that was, we don't use evidence very well in Australia. And at the centre of what we all do should be evidence, shouldn't it? What works and what doesn't? How do you get where you want to go? Well, our keynote speaker today, Brian Bumbarger, is a world expert in this, having studied the dissemination and the replication of evidence-based programs and community prevention coalitions for years and years and years. He's the Assistant Director of Knowledge Translation and Dissemination at the Prevention Research Centre at Penn State Uni in the United States, and he's also served as a specialist and consultant on criminal and juvenile justice, as a drug and gang specialist, and on delinquency and safe school issues. He's been an expert panellist for the US Department of Education's Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And listen to this, he's provided help to agencies in almost every US state, as well as consulting with a number of foreign governments. And today, he's our keynote speaker. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome back to Brisbane to Brian Bumbarger. Thank you, Brian.
Wonderful introduction. I'm glad that I could at least figure out how to work the PowerPoint. That would have been embarrassing. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you sincerely for inviting me to be here this morning to help you kick off or help you move further along in this really important and well thought out endeavor in Queensland. Of all of those things that were listed in my introduction, I want to add two more, probably more important things. I'm a husband and a father, and those are the things that really ground everything that I'm going to talk about. I'm a husband and a father, and I live in a community that I've lived in for quite a long time, and I want to live in for quite a long time. So I'm I'm committed to creating a place that looks like what you're describing in the nest and what you're trying to do here. So I'm not here today because I have all the answers. I think the reason I was invited here today is because the work that I've done in Pennsylvania over about the last 15 years resembles very closely the initiative that you're embarking on here in Queensland with the Nest and with a collective impact strategy that's grounded in data-informed decision-making, collaboration and coordination of services, putting children at the center, focusing especially on prevention and early intervention. So we've been doing that in Pennsylvania for about the last 15 years. And so I want to start out with a story that has a happy ending, because I think that's really important when you're launching into an endeavor that's as formidable as what you're getting into. It's nice to know, it's nice to hear from someone who's been there that it actually can work, that this is not just another passing policy fad that I think we learn that if I just keep my head down, this too shall pass. This is just yet another political fad that will come and go, and I'll just go back to doing what I've always been doing. This is really, as Jeff mentioned this morning, this really does represent a paradigm shift in the way we think about organizing communities and promoting better outcomes for children and families. So there's cause for optimism. As I said, we've been doing this in Pennsylvania for quite some time. And when we started out 15 years ago, we were really focused on this issue that was mentioned a few minutes ago about increasing the amount of evidence-based practice, or increasing the utilization of specific evidence-based interventions. We've gotten to the point in the United States where we've developed and evaluated so many interventions that have been found to be effective that we've gone, in a 40-year period, we've gone from thinking that nothing works to now we have so many things that have demonstrated some level of evidence of effectiveness that we've had to construct online searchable registries so that people can navigate all of these things that work to find the ones that are best suited to their individual community's needs. So that's the good news, but again, we have this challenge of getting all of that knowledge, all of that science and research out into practice, in the trenches, in communities, in schools and in homes, at a level, at a scale where we can move the needle on important population-level public health outcomes for kids and families. So we've done that in Pennsylvania, using, as I said, a very data-informed approach. So the middle bar graph that you see on this slide is just an example of the kind of data that one community, the community that I live in fact, gathered through a collective impact community coalition process. They gathered data on the known risk and protective factors that have been shown to statistically predispose children to a host of poor outcomes. And they use that data to narrow down their mission and their priorities, to narrow their field of view. Because one of the universal truths is that if you go into any community, you can find a countless number of people and organizations who care very deeply about children. And there's lots of resources. There's usually an abundance of resources and services in communities. But everybody's out there doing their own thing in their own way, based on their own ideas about what's important and what the problems are and what the solutions are. And that leads to a diffusion of resources where we're not as effective as we could be because everybody is working independently. So this idea, that's a fundamental part of the Nest, this idea of collective impact, of better coordination and joining up of services, is really important, because when it happens, truly, the sum is, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I like to think of the analogy of rays of sunshine. So individual rays of sunshine, you know, they're nice and they keep us warm and they make for pleasant days. But now I don't know if this is going to be relevant, because I haven't actually seen a magnifying glass in about 20 years. I don't even know if these things are still around, but do you remember playing with a magnifying glass as a child, and you could focus the sunlight through that magnifying glass and you could start a fire? And that's what this idea of collective efficacy is about. It's about taking those independent rays of sunshine that are probably great on their own, but focusing them like a laser on a few carefully, strategically selected priorities in that community and getting everybody moving in the same direction. And what we've seen in Pennsylvania, in doing this in over 100 different communities, we've seen that the result is dramatic. In Pennsylvania, in communities that have adopted this data-driven collective impact approach, we've seen significant reductions in youth crime and delinquency, significant reductions in youth drug and alcohol use, lower prevalence of these known risk factors that we're targeting, increases in protective factors that serve to buffer kids against the risks that exist in their lives. And we've seen better school engagement and academic achievement, significantly better school engagement and academic achievement. And this is important to point out, because this work that I'm describing in Pennsylvania, it was undertaken as a youth crime prevention initiative. It was funded by the State Crime Commission as a way to prevent and reduce antisocial behavior and youth crime. But because we weren't focusing on the narrowly defined behavioral outcome of youth crime or antisocial behavior, but instead focusing on these underlying risk and protective factors, we actually saw impact across a whole range of outcomes. And this is why prevention is so important. In addition to those outcomes that I just described, we saw significant reductions in deep end systems utilization that's very expensive and not very effective. And when we did a cost-benefit analysis of this endeavor over about a 10-year period, we determined that about a $60 million investment by the state government in rolling this initiative out in over 100 communities was saving taxpayers about $320 million in reduced court costs, reduced incarceration, both youth and adult incarceration, reduced drug and alcohol treatment, increased school graduation rates, which led to increased employment, which led to increased tax revenue for the state, and significant reductions in social service child welfare utilization. And so that $320 million return on a $60 million investment, that's a 5-to-1 return on investment. That's really important. So, you know, if you go to your state policymakers or your federal policymakers and you say, give me one tax dollar and I'll turn it into 5. They should be lining up for that, right? So that's the cause for optimism that we have. This can in fact work. But it's difficult and it's complicated. And first and foremost, it takes a real recognition of the complexity of child and adolescent development. This is a sort of a simplified picture of an idea that Yuri Bronfenbrenner introduced in the 70s about an ecological model for thinking about how humans develop. And it's important to understand all of the different levels of our lives that influence how we develop, how children develop especially. because we have to make sure that we're working on all those levels, at the individual child level, at the family level, at the community level, in schools, in peer groups. The thing that strikes me about this ecological model of thinking about how children develop and how we might intervene with kids to promote better outcomes, and adding to this complexity the developmental life course perspective that we heard about. That's another sort of layer of complexity. The thing that strikes me about this realist view of how children develop and how this should inform what we do is how strikingly different this is from the way our government systems are structured and the way our funding silos operate, right? They don't, the movement of human beings across these different micro and macro levels of the ecosystem is smooth and seamless. But that's not how governments operate, and that's not how the funding that addresses these issues works. So that's one important lesson in all of this, is this endeavor that you're embarking on, as much as it's about collective impact and data-driven decision-making and a focus on early intervention and prevention and putting children at the center, part of it has also got to be about system reform and government financing reform. And I'll get to the importance of that in a second. So, starting at the very center of that ecological, Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, we think about this on the most basic neural level. We think about the behavioral outcomes like educational success or antisocial behavior or drug use and crime, teen pregnancy. We think about these adolescent problem behaviors, for instance, that we're trying to tackle. And we really need to trace them back to the fundamental neural development in children. So we know that primary prevention, starting early in childhood, can capitalize on what we do know about the brain's vast plasticity, that we can actually nurture and rewire the regulatory systems in children's prefrontal cortex by some very simple things that we do very early in life. So a couple of nights ago, I had dinner with a group of key leaders here in Brisbane, and I told them about the community coalition that I'm part of, and one of the fairly simple interventions that they undertook, they decided to identify all the moms who are giving birth in the local hospital and to give them a very inexpensive, what we in America call a snuggly, a front baby carrier, so that they could carry their babies on their chest in physical contact with them. And that was not the norm. The norm was to carry your baby in a bassinet down at your side like a sack of groceries. But research has demonstrated that just that simple act of promoting physical contact between moms and their babies in early infancy leads to significantly greater mother-child bonding and a sense of warmth, and it influences the way mothers interact with their children as they grow into toddlerhood, and it literally translates into better school readiness at entry into kindergarten. So this is the message about you cannot start too early. We think about this, another level of this Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. We think about classrooms, for instance, and we think about what our sort of traditional view of the operation and function of classrooms is. And again, we go back to this idea of, well, let's get beyond just the sort of conventional wisdom about classrooms being a place to teach children knowledge and skills, and think about it as a potential place to develop early, strong bonds. Well, to do that, we have to take care of the teachers themselves. So, for instance, we're at the Prevention Research Center where I work, we're running a trial right now where we're teaching teachers practice mindfulness and meditation. In the United States, we've found that a significant proportion of teachers, a significantly higher proportion of teachers than the general population are on antidepressant medications, prescribed antidepressant medications. Teaching is a difficult profession. It burns people up. So we need to nurture and take care of teachers so that they can be in a better position to have warm, positive interactions and bonding with the children in their classroom. So these are just two examples of the complexity of this formula and all of the levels of risk and protective factors. And I'm reinforcing the complexity of the nature of influences. Influences clearly demonstrated by research in terms of being statistically causal relationships, or correlations at least. I'm pointing this out not to make you think that this is an impossible task, but to move us away from these naive, overly simplistic ideas that we can punish people out of bad outcomes. I mean, this is really the default in America. We think in every situation that if we just make harsh consequences, it will make people turn out better. And it's just not that simple. It's a little more complicated than that. So I talked about risk and protective factors a few minutes ago, and this is if, I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with this language of risk and protective factors, but it's fundamentally important to understand, and understand at a fairly sophisticated level, because it's important in a lot of different ways. First of all, as I said, the risk and protective factors occur in every domain of a child's life. So you can't just be working with the family and addressing risk factors that are going on in the home if there's also overwhelming risk in the community where the child lives, or in the school that they go to, or in the peer group that they interact with. And all the variations of those combinations. So it's important to recognize that risk occurs across all these different developmental domain or ecological domains. It's also important to understand that that multiple risk and protective factors in multiple domains can predispose kids to a single poor outcome, right? So this is the concept of equifinality. So there are a lot of different risk factors associated with one poor outcome. That's important when we're thinking about how we define strategies in individual communities, because it means that you can have two communities that are struggling to address the same problem, let's say youth drug use, as indicated here. You could have two communities that are trying to reduce youth drug and alcohol use, but the underlying risk factors that are most prevalent might be different in one community than another community. And it means that that the strategies that communities do adopt to address the same problem might be different from one community to another. So a big part of what we're talking about here is not giving communities the answer. It's about installing a capacity within communities to continuously seek out and make the best decisions about what is the answer for them in that specific community. Another thing that's important to recognize about this matrix of risk and protective factors is that these risk factors that are listed on the left side of the table, they're the same risk factors that predispose kids to a lot of different poor outcomes. And again, so that's really, really fundamentally important, because it means that if instead of focusing on a narrowly defined behavioral outcome like bullying or truancy, or smoking, if instead of focusing on a narrowly defined behavioral outcome, we focus on reducing the underlying risk factors like family strengthening or parent-child bonding or community strengthening, that we might actually impact multiple poor outcomes, as I described in what happened in Pennsylvania. So that's really important to keep in mind, because it really should influence the fundamental decisions that we make. So knowing all this about risk and protective factors, it stands to reason then that one important aspect in this endeavor of collective impact, this kind of collective impact effort, one fundamentally important part of it has to be diagnostic problem identification, right? So we need to find out in each community what are the most prevalent risk and protective factors, because that's going to influence everything that we decide to do. And so that's about installing community surveillance systems, community health surveillance systems, so that on an ongoing basis we can be constantly monitoring what's going on in the community at all of those different ecological levels. Now, you have no shortage of data to do this. You're swimming in data here in Queensland. So there's lots of data that's available to you. I'm sure you recognize some of these things. This is your Queensland and Australia and Brisbane data. And that's very good. And there's going to be lots of discussion about this data throughout the course of the day. The question, the important issue is, how do we use this data? It's no small effort to collect this amount of data. So there are some important questions. Are we collecting the right kind of data? Are we collecting it and reporting it back to people in a way that actually facilitates productive uses of the data? This is really important, because there are countless efforts by government around the world to collect data in the name of accountability, and it's basically used, or it's seen to be used, to punish people. And when practitioners think that data is only being used, and when they experience that data is only being used either to catch them doing something wrong, or it's not even used for anything, it's just a bureaucratic hoop they have to jump through to get their money, then what happens is they don't connect data with being a tool for continuous quality improvement, right? It's not a tool to enable you to do what you're doing better. It's just some silly bureaucratic hoop you have to jump through. Or if you think it's a potential trap to punish you or take your money away, then what happens? Then then the people that are responsible for reporting the data end up gaming the system, and becomes the data loses all value. So we really have to think carefully about how we can make this data useful in productive, actionable ways. Just having the data in front of you does not automatically translate into, answers and capacity to get better at what we do. So how can we apply all of this information that we have and this knowledge that we've gained? So several decades of research have shown that programs that target these etiological underpinnings, these risk and protective factors, are most effective and have lasting effects. Evidence-based strategies exist from the prenatal period through adolescence. So like I said, there are lots and lots of things actually that have now demonstrated effectiveness. So now the challenge is not that nothing works, it's that how do we weed through all of this information about what works to make sure that we're not only making decisions about adopting programs and strategies based on the evidence, but also on the practical issues of fit and feasibility. Sometimes the thing with the strongest evidence is not a good match to our community's needs. So we have to be practical and not dogmatic about our use of evidence. Most of these evidence-based programs prevent multiple problems, as I've described. Implementation is really important. These aren't magic pills. They're not spells that you just say the words and everybody gets better. They have to be implemented with quality and fidelity, so that when you deliver something in your community, it looks similar to what was shown to be effective. They're likely to be particularly effective for disadvantaged children, and this is not something that's well known, and it almost flies in the face of what we would expect. Many of the programs that have demonstrated evidence of effectiveness actually have shown stronger effects on the most high-risk kids, right? And that's what we want. And the potential lifetime benefits of preventing mental, emotional, and behavioral problems are the greatest with primary prevention and early intervention. So again, starting early, focusing on prevention. We can't get away from that. So we have all of these evidence-based interventions, but another important reality is that the services, the service providers, the NGOs, and the government systems that have to make use of this evidence existed long before there was any evidence. These systems are older than these new evidence-based strategies. So it's naive to think that all of a sudden we have all these new evidence-based approaches, that they will automatically fit into the services and the NGOs and the government systems, both policy and funding, that exist out there. So there's a big issue here with innovation without capacity development. So we really need to focus a lot of attention in this, and it's discussed quite a bit in the NEST plan about increasing the capacity of NGOs and service providers to be better able, to be better capable of adopting and delivering evidence-based strategies. And part of that leads to too much push and not enough pull. Because there is this lack of fit between these new evidence-based strategies and what service providers and NGOs are currently delivering and what they've been delivering for decades, because there is this lack of fit, all of the movement about bringing science to practice is push. It's mostly push. And we want more pull. What we want to do is stop forcing NGOs and providers to do these things because they're on lists, and start developing the capacities of NGOs and service providers to be excellent at whatever they do. And if they're excellent at whatever they do, they will on their own come to want to pull in the best practices. And they will want to figure out a way to make those new evidence-based practices fit within what they do in the broader sense. A big part of building this capacity, how am I doing for time? 15 minutes, okay, thank you. So a big part of building this capacity is this relatively new idea of backbone organizations. And that's the organization that I direct in Pennsylvania is called the Epicenter, the Evidence-Based Prevention and Intervention Support Center. And it's a backbone organization, meaning that what we do is we don't deliver services. We work as a technical assistance provider and a capacity builder and a facilitator and a knowledge convener across a large network of service providers to help them all get better at everything they do. And some of that is about getting better at doing specific evidence-based packaged interventions like P. But some of it is also, but it's equally important to help them get better at everything they do. So be better at data-driven decision-making, be better at instituting a culture of coaching and feedback and implementation quality monitoring, right? Those general skills that are necessary to really be an effective service provider organization. That's really the missing piece, I think, in all of this. Now, getting back to this important aspect of what you're doing, which is this idea of collective impact. Collective impact is, again, it's about focusing on coordination and collaboration and facilitating this coordination and collaboration, which doesn't occur naturally. Henry Ford said that coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is a success. Someone else said that collaboration is an unnatural act between unwilling adults. Collaboration doesn't just occur naturally. It's something that has to be facilitated. If you think I'm wrong, go home tonight and call up 12 of your neighbors and introduce yourself and say, hello, neighbor, you may not know me, even though we live in the same neighborhood, but I've decided to take a dozen of my neighbors out to dinner and a movie tonight. My treat. All we have to do is we all have to agree on which movie and which restaurant, right? Well, that should be easy. We're all in this, we all want the same thing. We want to be fed and entertained and on, somebody else's dime. Certainly, we all have the same goals there. This should be easy to come up with, come to agreement, right? You get where I'm going with this. So this is really challenging to bring a whole network of service providers, for example, or policymakers together and agree on shifting the focus, even slightly, shifting the focus of how we're going to go about doing the work that we do, much less this gigantic paradigm shift. So one lesson that I've learned that I can bestow in hindsight is that the conventional wisdom about collaboration is to focus on this tiny piece in the middle where our goals and our ideas and our vision does overlap, right? And that's better outcomes for youth, right? We all want this. So we're talking about child development researchers who are developing interventions. We're talking about policymakers who fund services and systems. Talk about practitioners and providers and service providers and NGOs. Surely, we have this one thing in common. We want better outcomes for youth. But if you focus just on this little area of overlap, I assure you, you're not going to make much progress in true collective impact. All you're really going to do is reinforce the status quo. You'll have a lot of meetings where every couple of months everybody comes together and you go around the table and everybody says a little bit about what they're doing, and then you have a sandwich, and then you all go back to your separate offices and organizations and you just keep doing what you've always been doing. That's not collaboration, that's information sharing, right? And it doesn't lead to change. True collaboration recognizes the really big parts of these circles that don't overlap. It recognizes them, it acknowledges them, it speaks their name, and it honors them. It says to the school superintendent or school principal, listen, I know that in the grand scheme of things, we're all in the business of making the world a better place. But I also recognize that you're judged by how your students perform on these state standards tests or whatever, or how many kids show up in your classroom. And I realize that trying to, have your primary school classroom teachers take time out of their day to learn about mindfulness and meditation might be something that you see as a diversion from your mission, and I recognize that. So let's work together on that. So the reality is, you think about practitioners. In addition to making the world a better place, they want to serve lots of families. I mean, they have to report to their boards of directors or foundations or whatever, and they need to demonstrate that they touched lots of people's lives. That's a practical goal. And they need to keep their people employed, right? It's one thing to go in and say, just adopt this mission, NGO, and stay true to it. But the reality is that if they're operating on a shoestring budget and a string of short-term grants, if the next grant opportunity that comes out forces them to slightly shift their mission a little bit, and they need to do that to keep their doors open and keep their people employed, we have to honor that, right? That's true collaboration. Policymakers, they need to spread the money around. I've had lots of conversations with the policymakers where I work, and I've tried to point out to them that when I plot all the dots on the map of where we're offering services and they're funding services, and then we plot on the map where all the problems are, those two maps don't correlate, right? They're putting a lot of money into communities where the problems aren't the greatest, and they're in the name of spreading the money around. But that's what they have to do. That's the reality of their life as elected officials. And they want quick, simple solutions too. So we need to look for quick wins too, not just we all know that we're in this for the long haul, but we need some quick wins too so that we're meeting politicians' needs. And researchers have their own, needs, uncontaminated trials and getting papers published. Oh, I've frozen. Here we go. So I've touched on this before, but I want to reiterate that don't lose sight of the fact that in all of the work that you undertake under this NEST initiative, that's about, again, data-driven decision-making, a focus on prevention and early intervention, collective impact and joining up of services. Don't lose sight of the fact that for any of this to matter, it also has to genuinely include system reform. Because as Patrick McCarthy, the president of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, said, the road to scale runs through public systems. And none of this will make a difference if our government systems and silos are dysfunctional and work at cross purposes with what we're trying to do. And this simply means that we need to make sure that our government officials are part of this. They're partners with us in this endeavor. That's the way it has to happen. And that, again, that goes back to the role of the backbone organization. In the work that I do in Pennsylvania, the epicenter, we not only see ourselves as a backbone organization across all this network of service providers and building their capacity, but we also have adopted the role of an intermediary organization. We are the intermediary between community-level service providers and practitioners and the government policymakers and funders. And in hindsight, we've recognized that there are many, many, many examples, countless examples, where if somebody didn't take on that role of being an intermediary, there would be problems that were just deal breakers and non-starters that would never get addressed. They would never get solved. In the dinner that I mentioned earlier that I had with some local key leaders a few nights ago, a superintendent brought up the example of the barriers of information sharing. So he mentioned that he had a student that had recently been placed into juvenile detention for some offense that he had committed, and then later so he had spent the night in juvenile detention and then was released and then came to school the next day. And the principal knew nothing about this, and he needed to know about this to make an effective educational plan for that child. And so we rang up the juvenile court, and they just threw up this barrier. Well, we can't share that information with you. That's private and confidential. And I assure you, Australia has not cornered the market on that. We've got lots of that in the U.S. and in Pennsylvania. And when that has come up in Pennsylvania, as an intermediary, when we started hearing that from multiple service providers, that was a significant barrier to them being more effective with children. We took it as the intermediary back to the state policymakers, and we took it clear up to the cabinet secretaries and the bureau and division directors, and we said, "This is what's going on." And they said, "Well, we didn't know. We didn't know that was happening. That's easy to fix. We'll establish some waivers. They actually developed a cross-systems training program on confidentiality and information sharing so that practitioners actually knew what the real rules were. They didn't just assume that there's just a blanket barrier against any information sharing. That's just one example. Finally, I want to point out that this issue of the importance of the financial implications of focusing early, really early, like I said, even prenatally, on pregnant moms or moms and their newborn babies. This is economic analysis from Jim Heckman that I borrowed this slide from a woman named Karen McCluskey, who is in the violence reduction unit in the Scottish police force in Glasgow, one of the most violent cities in the world. And she shared this information last week down in Melbourne at a criminology conference, and it shows the perverse inverse relationship about where public investment generates the biggest return, which is you know, in very early age 0, 1, 2, 3, versus what our budgets typically look like. So the biggest return on investment is this really, really early investment. But when we look at how our public tax dollars are spent, it's the inverse of that. We usually end up spending much more on adolescents and adults and in treatment and in prisons and in deep end services. So I'm gonna close by just reminding you that I started out by saying this can be done. I want you to be realistic about how difficult it is and how much work it's going to take and what close attention it will require. But remember, I started out by saying we did this, and we stumbled through. So I hope that I've at least identified a few potential pitfalls that you might be able to avoid, because in the end, this requires a commitment from the Capitol, a commitment from City Hall, a commitment from the workers in the trenches, the neighborhood, the superintendent's office or the principal's office, and the dining room table. We're all going to have to work at this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And it comes down to planning and thinking, doesn't it? Everything you said, from getting the evidence to analysing it, to talking, to networking, to getting people on side and then communicating a plan. I know we're running a few minutes over, and we will have another chance to talk to Brian a bit later, but I'd love to open it and just take a couple of questions before we go on to the next session. It's not often you get the chance to question someone like Brian or to make a comment on what he said, and I'd love us to do that now. So who'd like to be brave enough to go first? And I understand it's always very hard in the morning, so you put your hand up as I was speaking. I always bring a good bottle of red for the first person who asks a question. I won't tell you when I give away the next one, so thank you.
It's been a pleasure to listen to you, Brian. My name is Norma, and I'm the manager of the Family Relationship Centre at Logan. The Family Relationship Centres are an example of a post-structural approach to managing change. And what I'd like to ask you is, you're an example to me of an individual making a difference. How did you influence the people that hold the power in government?
Well, I think that's a big question that there are probably a million different little answers to. I think one of the sort of epiphanies that I've had over the years is that one of the most important challenges for child savers, I'll call us, in working with government officials. One of the things that I didn't mention is that in this 15-year endeavor that we had in Pennsylvania, we went through 4 different governors, both political parties, and both ends of the spectrum in terms of conservative versus liberal. And surprisingly, we made the most progress under conservative Republican administrations, which wouldn't be what you would have guessed, because the conservative Republicans in the United States are not the child savers. They're they're about small government and lower taxes, but they're about fiscal responsibility. So the important lesson that I learned is you need to carefully craft your argument based on who you're talking to. So when we were preparing a report for the Democratic liberal governor, we prepared a report that described case studies of outcomes from communities that had initiated this process, and told stories about specific children and families, along with data about outcomes. The Republican members of our state legislature, they read that fantastic outcome report, and the yawn was deafening. It's not that they didn't care. It's just that wasn't what was important to them, first of all, and they assumed that things were going that all this government investment was producing good outcomes anyway. So they weren't surprised that we were able to show some outcomes in a report. We followed that up with this economic analysis report that I talked about that showed the financial return on investment And we immediately were asked to present at a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, which the Judiciary Committee establishes policy and the Appropriations Committee establishes funding resources.
So you won it on economic terms, and,
we
and
did,
you deliberately tailored
with that audience.
Yes.
With that, and that's the beauty. Again, that's the beauty of evidence-based approaches that focus on early prevention. You can tick both those boxes. You're going to get good outcomes, and you're going to get positive return on investment and taxpayer savings.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Kathy and I'm from Victoria. I'm an Aracy convener as well, and I'm interested in what you were saying about the relationship between the practitioners and the researchers and the academics. Transparency is clearly very important, but transparency is not always possible. I spoke to a young woman this morning who was telling me that she had just done a literature review for the Canadian government and the UK government task forces on, for terrorism, I suppose, control or prevention or something like that. When the work was done, the papers were put in, the response from the Canadian Mounted Police was, this isn't useful for practitioners. And I think it happens over and over and over again, where governments will actually ask for something, and then when it's provided back to them, they're not happy with it because it's not useful for practitioners. So, I mean, that point that you made about governments needing to address policy, etc., they may have very good intentions, but it can be crappy, terrible policy that gets no one anywhere because it can't be utilised flexibly on the ground. So I suppose what I'd like to ask you is a question around your comment about, first of all, writing for an audience, but also perhaps writing for an audience plus other audiences. Because I think sometimes we just spend too much time writing for an audience. It can't be translated. We have researchers and governments working together, but they're not in the same place.
All right, let's have a fairly brief answer to that one
Sure,
if we can.
sure.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, you know, again, it goes back to what I mentioned about the backbone organization also serving the role of an intermediary. An intermediary maybe isn't the best word. It's more like a convener, because an intermediary implies that we're running back and forth between these different groups, practitioners and researchers and policymakers, while they remain disconnected. What we really do is we convene them together. We sort of force them to all sit down at the table and to work as a team. So when a report is being developed, it's being developed collaboratively between the researchers, the policymakers, and the practitioners, and so they're feeding into the writing of the report so that all of their perspectives are reflected. Now there are countless examples where we've actually developed multiple products to convey the same message to different audiences, and we do that a lot. So we write academic journals because that's what academicians need to do, but we do fact sheets and we do 140-character Twitter posts. So.
And Brian is around for the day. We're also going to have morning tea in about, not too much longer. And he is very open to you coming up and asking him a question and providing feedback and just, I guess, discussing the issues you've raised. Please put your hands together for Brian Bumbaja.
Thank you.
Targets detailed in the nest are for Australia to be in the top 5 OECD countries for education performance, physical well-being, social and emotional well-being, and children participating in issues affecting them by 2025. So that begs the question, where are we now? The aim of our next session is to show that through a series of short data presentations. The aim here is that we are going to hear what is happening, which will then be coloured in our later sessions, and hopefully with your views too. But here in Queensland, where do we stand at 10:35 a.m. on June 19, 2014? If we draw a line in the sand, what are the headline indicators? We hear about obesity in children and NAPLAN and what we should or shouldn't be doing in education and health. But let's find out, taking Brian's lead, what the data is showing us on health and education here in Queensland. Now, I've set a fairly tight 10-minute limit for each of our guests, if that's okay. And we're going to start with the Commission for Children and Young People with the Acting Director of Research, Fiona Borman. You put out an annual snapshot of the state's children, which picks up a lot of data that other areas don't. So can we get you to share with us now? Thank you, Fiona.
Sorry about that. I'll just let the Jeff hopefully locate the presentation. Thank you very much, Brian. I guess it was very encouraging to see our snapshot report was one of those presentations that Brian featured, and I've got our key data booklets out on the front table for anybody who wishes to have a look at those. This one was published back in August last year, so and I have, for this presentation, just updated some of the information that's in there and just focusing on some of the issues. That's it. Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, I just want to, first up, just set the scene, looking at demographics. And this is from the ABS, obviously, and from 2012, just to, as I said, set the scene for our Queensland population. In total, there's around 4.6 million people in Queensland, and around 1.1 million, or about 23%, are children, so under the age of 18. And you can see the relative size of those population segments there, as probably everybody knows, we know the ageing population, that over the next continuing time, that population in 65 and over will increase, and there'll be a marginal decrease in our population under the age of 18 as a proportion of the population. Breaking it down just into more meaningful chunks or understandable chunks, at each year of age there's about 60,000 children in each. So from under one, there's about 60,000 children, so on up to about 17 years of age, up and down around that number. And in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, overall in Queensland, there's around 3% of the population is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Under the age of 18, it's actually a larger proportion. It's around 6.6%. And 60 to 70, around 70,000 children in total. From the census, we know that most children and really most of the population live in the southeast corner of Queensland, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba areas. And that, I didn't check the figures beforehand, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders too, the majority of those children live in urban centres rather than regional or remote areas so much. So we also have within the population around 9% of children were born overseas, and those top countries are New Zealand, England and South Africa is where they come from, but many, many countries more than that. And around 9% also have a language other than English at home. And those top three languages, Mandarin, Vietnamese and Samoan. So that's setting the scene for what our population in Queensland looks like. I'm just going to briefly digress onto lifestyle factors, maybe connections, good, bad, maybe not so. And just probably what many of you would know, that almost all children access the internet, and this data was from just over 2 years ago, so it's probably changed, increased since then. Many of them own mobile phones, and by the age of, by high school age, the majority own mobile phones. We also know that many children do experience cyberbullying. Around 1 in 5 of 16 to 17-year-olds have experienced cyberbullying in some form. Or some other connections, by year 12, many students have had sex. And while it's encouraging, the majority have used condoms, around 3/4, but there's still those who aren't using that protection against pregnancy and STIs. Then I guess the other health risks we can see, while the majority of young people have never smoked, we still have, by the age of 17, around 9% are committed smokers, and there are also those minority of young people who are using alcohol at risky levels, both short-term and with possible lifetime consequences. And there's some who have also used illicit drugs. So that's just a bit more scene setting of our population. I'm going to skip health and education. We have some other speakers talking about those indicators. So I'm just going to go through some of our child mortality, causes of death, what we can see there. The encouraging news is child mortality deaths are decreasing over the longer term. You can see infant mortality has dropped to about 5 deaths per 1,000 live births. That's averaged over 3 years. They tend to be relatively small numbers, so the data we've got is smoothed by averaging over 3 years. So over the 2 decades, we can see there it's slowly dropping, as is mortality under the age of 4, which is at 4 weeks. And for 1 to 17-year-olds, you can also see there's quite significant drops in mortality rates for children. Major contributors really across the age groups are those developments in medical treatment. Improvements in vehicle safety are also significant, and for the under 5 population, improvements in pool safety over the long term have also decreased mortality rates. Just looking at causes of death. So this one just looking at infant deaths, and in that first few weeks of life, that's where there's predominantly those deaths are due to perinatal conditions from the perinatal period or congenital malformations. Just over 90% of deaths are caused by those factors. Between 4 weeks and up to a year, there's still those conditions from birth or pre-birth that are having effect there. But what you'll also notice is sudden infant death syndrome is quite a significant, is our leading cause of death in that 4 weeks, between 4 weeks to 1 year. So around a third of deaths in that period are due to those undetermined causes. So the sudden infant death plus undetermined causes are kind of interlinked. Undetermined, we're not really sure, but it may be around sudden infant death. Looking at those age 1 to 17 years, we start to see an impact in the causes on some of those life stages, I guess. Transport incidents are leading cause of death for children in each of the age groups. And you'll also notice that for the 15 to 17-year-olds, there's actually a much higher number. These numbers, to explain, are over 3 years. They're not an average, they're straight numbers of deaths. And you'll see the percentage down at the 15 to 17-year-olds compared to the other children, there's double the number of deaths from transport incidents, and that's really, we've got driving age and probably risk-taking behaviour as well contributing there. For the under 5s, you'll notice that drowning is the second leading cause of death, or a shared leading cause of death. But as I mentioned earlier, the rate of mortality rate from drowning has been decreasing steadily over the years, and in the 90s we had the pool fencing and various changes, and there's still a focus on that, which is needed. Neoplasms, or cancer-related deaths, also feature for children 5 to 14 years. And the other feature we'll notice then for 15 to 17 years is suicide as a leading cause of death. And you'll also further concerning is that we also have deaths of children between the age of 10 and 14 from suicide. And you'll see there it's so 15 deaths over the 3 years, so it contributed 16% of all deaths of 10 to 14-year-olds over that period. I'm going to move on now to child protection, which is the topic that was in the program there. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about, as a lead into the child protection reforms. And I'm going to give some broad brush illustration of what the triggers were, and particularly the increases in child protection over the last 8 years really triggered the child protection inquiry that was led by Tim Carmody. And it's also led to an agreement to the major reforms of the child protection system. So this figure is showing the number of intakes, and I guess I should point out this is intakes to the child protection system, so phone calls to child safety about concerns about children. And I'll just point out this isn't an indicator of underlying child abuse and neglect. This is our administrative data for what reports come to child safety. In fact, the bigger influence on information like this is in fact system changes, practice changes, people being more risk averse, people wishing to report concerns, and maybe a bit of disconnect with families where instead of calling, dropping into families, they may ring up child safety report concerns. So what we can see here is that intakes have increased from about 80,000 to 120,000 per year over that 8-year period. What you can see down the bottom part, the orange section, is notifications, so that's where those phone calls have actually reached the threshold of being a child possibly at risk of harm. The blue section are those calls where it's called child concern reports, are those where there are issues, but it's not a statutory intervention stage. So those ones, there may be provided information, but they don't reach that threshold. What I've added to that figure now is just the substantiation. So the red section down the bottom indicates what proportion of those overall intakes are actually substantiated, and which means they meet the risk of harm that we set in our system. And you'll see that, in fact, you'll notice there is notifications are actually fairly steady and have actually decreased over the period, as have substantiations have decreased. Meanwhile, we're getting an increasing number of phone calls. What I wanted to, which is one of those leads into the reforms, as I mentioned, was we have this gap between, I guess, those risk factors, and Brian has talked about those risk factors in his presentation. And I guess if you think about it, then these calls to child safety, which do not get progressed, so there's no further action for those child concern reports, apart from giving people information on the phone. There's no opportunities for services, family intervention services that we're looking for and that has been talked about. So this is a challenge for the system as it stands. This is one of the triggers that continue, because these calls, these investigations, all of this costs a lot of money, and if we continue to have those increases into the future, it is very much unsustainable to continue that. So the aim of the reforms, and I guess I would only say then just that red section is where we get those child protection interventions, so statutory interventions with children, that may be supervision, or it may be children being removed and placed in a care system. So one of the aims of the reforms, and Steve Armitage, our Children's Commissioner, is going to be on the panel a bit later and may have a chance to talk about the child protection reforms. Those reforms are aimed at providing opportunities, early intervention services and family support services, and as well as looking at the prevention services to really offer an alternative to calls to the child safety to say this child is having problems. So it's giving notifiers, those within health and school sector, the police, other services to go to rather than a statutory intervention. And I might wrap up. One more. I'll just finish on the numbers of children in out-of-home care, which is also related. Now, if you think back, I just mentioned those number of notifications, substantiations hasn't actually changed much. In fact, it has had a decrease over the recent period. And I guess the observation here is that number of children in out-of-home care has been increasing. These are numbers of children as at 30 June, so it's just a point-in-time measure each year. You'll see that which another challenge for our child protection system and a cost. You'll see that, in fact, the largest increase has been in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care, another challenge for the system. And this is, if we can then improve those early intervention services, there'll still be children who will need out-of-home care, But hopefully if in the longer term these reforms will actually provide the services and then intervene at an earlier time with families to stop that progression into the statutory system and to actually placing children in out-of-home care, then hopefully we can address that increase.
All right, thank you, Fiona. Could you please put your hands together for Fiona Borman? And that snapshot data you can find in the terrace area where we get our morning tea. And I was thinking about the definition of, some people are half glass full, half glass empty. And Brian said earlier, he's here as a father and a parent as much as an expert, as we all are. And as Fiona was saying that, and she said, good news is 3/4 of children who have sex before year 12 use a condom. As a mother of a 9 and a 10-year-old, I'm thinking 1/4 of them don't. Glass half empty. So now could I please welcome to the stage Sue McKee, who is General Manager Operations at Children's Health here in Queensland. And Sue's going to shine a spotlight on the health of our young children and young people for the next 10 minutes. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here representing Children's Health Queensland and providing this symposium with some data on the current state of the health of children in Queensland and some of the issues that not only the healthcare sector faces but that we all face, and the challenge to improve the lives of children in Queensland. Being a Queenslander, as I am, and being very, very proud of that, and being often the first and the best at many things, unlike last night at the Rugby League, and unlike in some of the data that I'm going to show you, we are certainly not the first and we're certainly not the best. Even though Fiona and I spoke yesterday, we have doubled up on some of our data. As you can see, 23.8% of Queenslanders are children or young people. Defining what is in the bailiwick of kids is a little bit difficult and depends on who you talk to. My data is about kids from 0 to 17, which seems to be the current trend here today. So what does that mean? There's over 1 million children in Queensland, and out of the 4.5 million people that we have. Just to break that down, 56% are under 9 years of age and 44% are between 10 and 17. As you can see, and we've already talked about this, over 6.5% are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and around 9% were born overseas. And as we've already spoken about, Mandarin, Vietnamese and Samoan are the languages that children speak at home. So from the beginning, let's start with birth. In the last decade, there's been over a 30% increase in registered births in Queensland. Is that about actually people registering more, or is that about actual more births? The data's a little bit out on that. Over 63,000 plus births, just over 5,000 of these were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Around 1,000 are multiple births, which is actually higher than the national average. Of interest, the teenage fertility rate in 2011 was the lowest it's ever been recorded. 2.16% of births, 21.6 births per 1,000 women aged 19 years and under. However, the rate for teenage and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is almost 4 times higher than that. There's been little change in the proportion of babies born prematurely and those with low birth weights over the last decade, which is interesting. As you can see, however, there's a significant difference between the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population and the Queensland average. It's becoming more increasingly evident there's significant risk in being born preterm or with a low birth weight, such as vision and hearing impairment, increased risk of SIDS, impaired cognitive skill level, cerebral palsy for premature infants, delayed physical growth, etc. All of which put pressure on not only families and the community in which they live, but also the systems that support them, including health, education and social services. It's been well known for a long time now that breastfeeding provides protective health benefits for both the infant and the mother, particularly in relation to immune status and long-term health. And although that the NH and MRC recommend breastfeeding exclusively until 6 months of age, this does pose some significant logistic problems for most women, particularly those wanting to return to work or return to normal life, because the difference or the distance between the breast and the baby often becomes a problem. A significant factor in maintaining people's health and the society in which they live is their ability to read and understand. Health literacy means more than just being able to read a pamphlet and successfully make an appointment. Health literacy is the extent to which consumers can obtain information, process it, understand the information about their healthcare and the services that the health system can provide. It also refers to the consumer's capacity to use that information to make decisions about their healthcare. Improved capacity to use health information effectively enables people to make better calls about their health. If only 44% of the population meet the literacy standard required to understand the information we provide, raises the issue of what percentage are able to use this information to navigate what is a very complex system. One of the more topical health issues, and it often creates a great debate, is around immunisation. Queensland currently targets 90% of children to be immunised, fully vaccinated to the age of 5. As you can see, we're very close to meeting this target. This is probably the best statistic I've got all day. It drops off slightly at the 5-year mark, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are actually doing a little bit better in this space. But that's about the best news I've got. Another significant health issue and an issue for the whole of society is disability. Intellectual disability accounts for the greatest proportion of disability in Queensland children and young people, closely followed by obviously physical disability. As you can see, in relation to disability per 1,000 children, intellectual disability numbers increase with age. I would speculate that this is probably due to the fact that it's quite difficult to measure intellectual disability in a small child. Whereas physical disability numbers fluctuate with age, and I'll leave it to some of my more learned colleagues to understand what that might be about. Potentially, though, it's the mortality rate in that 5 to 14-year age group. Every era in every country around the world has different things to worry about. For example, we're no longer worried about the bubonic plague coming to kill a large proportion of the population. We now just have to worry about New South Welshmen coming to beat us football. It's all over now, I'll get over it eventually. The past 100 years, the concerns for health of our children has changed. In the early part of the last century, what has been defined as the classical era, and please I'll use a bit of poetic licence when I talk about eras, from the turn of the century to around 1950s, we were concerned about infectious diseases, high infant mortality rates, poor nutrition, few cures for chronic diseases, epidemics such as polio and influenza, and diseases of overcrowding. In the age of what I call the hippie, again poetic licence, from the 60s to the 80s, they are calling it the new morbidity. We had cured many of the woes of the earlier millennia through antibiotics and vaccination programs, but we've become much more concerned about family dysfunction, learning disabilities, emotional disorders, functional distress and educational needs. The age of excess, which was the 80s and 90s, I do remember it well. Although it was an era of excess, it was also an era of social conscience. There was a greater global awakening which highlighted for Australia some of our very shortcomings that had not been commonly visible until now. Such things as homelessness and domestic violence. Community efforts were on preventing disease and promoting health focus on social disarray, some of those epidemics of violence. So for the 2000s, we are now in what we know as the millennial morbidity era, and I couldn't think of anything funny to say about that. Disorders of the bioenvironment, such as allergies, are a key part of what we're worried about. Socioeconomic influence on health, for example, poverty, health disparities, technological influences on health, our obesity problem, and our mental health concerns are the wicked problems that we're talking about now. So for Queenslanders, what does this mean? In 2011, over 44% of kids were meeting the recommended 60 minutes of moderate exercise a day. 43% exceeded the recommended maximum of 2 hours of recreational TV time. From a nutritional perspective, almost 60% of 5 to 17-year-olds in Queensland consume the daily recommended fruit serve. Only just on 30% consume the recommended daily serves of vegetables. Almost half of Queensland's children ate takeaway at least once a week. This era has created what Moore and colleagues described as wicked problems. These are complex issues, and because of the way that society is currently structured, cross multiple boundaries. And as we've already heard from Brian this morning, the way that the organisations are structured doesn't actually support doing something about this easily. There is no one agency that is responsible or no one solution that can actually change the capacity to address these issues. This final slide's in relation to mental health. In my opinion, this is the big sleeper for us coming forward. Mental health is defined by the World Health Organisation, which has been adopted by Queensland Health. Mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realises his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stress of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Mental health is influenced by a complex interplay of biological, psychosocial, social, economic and environmental factors. As I said, a wicked problem. As you can see from the statistics, 1 in 6 kids suffers from some form of anxiety, stress or depression. However, what we also know is that mental health disorders are often undiagnosed in children and young people, so this number could be much, much higher. And one of the more concerning statistics of the morning is, as you can see, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population have a 6-fold increased risk of suicide than the average Queenslander. There are a variety of risk factors included for suicide, and these are not limited to a single cause, including drug and alcohol use, mental health, a history of child abuse, being known to the child protection system, and it seems like a lot more people are being known to the child protection system, living in rural or remote Queensland, or obviously being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. It's just some of the references, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Not a pretty picture you painted, is it? But it comes down to what Brian said about knowing the facts, having the evidence and going from there. Let's turn our attention to education now with Catherine Woods, Executive Director, Program Management, Funding and Performance for the Department of Education, Training and Employment here in Queensland. And Catherine, as I understand it, you're going to focus on early childhood data and what it might be teaching us. Thank you.
While Jeff's finding that, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to say thanks to the organisers for today as well. He's found it. Fantastic, thanks. An interesting thing about the numbers of children is that I'm actually going to show you a different number. So I work for the Office for Early Childhood Education and Care, and our cohort of children is birth to 8 years. So the ABS data is often birth to 9 years, but we use a different lens. So the number that we use, and this is from 2013, is that there are 566,000 children in Queensland who are birth to 8, and of those 43,000 children are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So I don't think it's problematic. We're aligned with the Out of the Box Festival, if nothing else, which I was pleased to hear yesterday, although my kids are too old to go now. Just in terms of some data around early childhood education and care, and I hope that I know that I do have some more constructive and positive information about what's happening in relation to early childhood in the slides that I've got ahead. But just to give you a bit of a picture about what I'm talking about when I talk about the early childhood sector. So the Office for Early Childhood regulates early childhood services, so long day cares, kindergartens, family daycare, school-age care services. But we also work more broadly with a whole range of services that aren't regulated, which I'll talk about as well. But in terms of the services that are regulated in Queensland, there's 2,757 of those, and largely they're in the southeast Queensland corner. The state, except for a small number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services in remote Indigenous communities and also eKindi, the state doesn't deliver early childhood services. It's private for-profit providers, community organisations by and large that deliver early childhood services. So just to give you a bit of a sense, and those services are regulated under the National Quality Law, which many of you would be familiar with. So that's a lot of services and a lot of capacity and a lot of opportunity across the state to influence and impact children and families and what happens in those services. The number of kids that are actually enrolled in early childhood, so every year we do a census out of the office and get a sense of how many children are there, where are they, those kinds of things. And we know that there are 258,641 children enrolled in early childhood services. The trick here, well not the trick, but the issue here is that we go up to 12 years of age in this slide because of school-age care services. So you can see on the end there, in the pink, 18% of those 258,000 are in school-age care predominantly. But the big red piece of the pie is long daycare services. So 57% of the children who are enrolled in early childhood education and care in Queensland are in a long daycare service. And then the other, you can see there, nearly 10% in kindergarten services, a small number of limited hours care services, which are by and large in rural and remote locations, 10% in family daycare, and 21.9% in school-age care. Just to add, so while we know that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children is growing in the lower end cohort, only 4% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are actually enrolled in early childhood education and care. Many of you would know about the Universal Access to Kindergarten initiative, which has been implemented in Queensland through a national partnership agreement through all states and territories and the Commonwealth Government. So since 2009, there's been a very significant push in Queensland to increase the number of kids who are in kindy programs. So in 2008, 29% of kids were in a kindy program. Last year, 97% of Queensland children in the year before they started school were enrolled in a kindy program. So great opportunities in terms of improving the long-term learning outcomes for those kids. A range of strategies were introduced. Many of you would know them. I know many of you have actually been actively involved, and it really is through the goodwill and the collaboration with the sector and with the government to basically make this happen. As the state doesn't deliver the kindy programs, and all of these are actually happening through non-government providers. So I think it's pretty fantastic that last year most kids were in kindy. There is a lot of work yet to do. There is less than 78% of kids, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids are in kindy. So we need to do more work around that cohort of children. And there are also the culturally and linguistically diverse cohort of children, about 85%. So we need to do more work in relation to low socioeconomic, vulnerable and disadvantaged kids. What is the early childhood sector? My work at the Office for Early Childhood is predominantly around the universal platform for early childhood. Other parts of the Queensland Government work on the secondary and tertiary sectors or interventions for families who need additional support. So in relation to the universal platform, which is a safe and welcoming and soft entry really for families to the types of services and supports that they need in relation to their child. And given that it's birth to 8, we've included schools in there. But they're schools, playgroups, children and family centres, early years centres, hubs, long daycare centres, all of those other approved services that I talked about before. So the quality area, and I was really interested, Brian, in your points about collaboration and connections. Many of you who are working in early childhood would know that under the National Quality Framework, there's a quality area around collaboration. So collaboration with community and collaboration with families. And that is something, I guess, that needs to continue to be explored and leveraged in relation to early childhood services and what that means. We've certainly done a bit of work in the early childhood office around this, but there's more to be done. We do fund a range of integrated services. Sorry, these lights are very bright. We do fund a range of integrated services, and we've established a model for integrated early childhood working that's available on our website, but I know that there are many people here from those services today as well. So I just wanted to talk a bit about where they are. because these services are actually delivering quite good results for families, and families are certainly reporting that they've got more confidence as a parent in regard to having experienced the services and programs that they've been a part of. So what an integrated service means from my perspective is a place where families can access maternal and child health, early childhood education and care, and parent and family support. So we work with Queensland Health. Queensland Health actually delivers services in some of the centres, so particularly the early years centres. And I know that there are people from the Gowrie and the Benevolent Society here today. And also in the children and family centres. So the children and family centres are specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and have also been created or established under a national partnership agreement. So we've got pretty good coverage across the state in relation to integrated early years services, but there are some big gaps. And if you wanted to map that with AEDI, it would be interesting, I think. But just to say that there are 25 hubs. By and large, we fund those for a coordinator because we know that coordination costs, we know that collaboration costs, and that families need to be able to seamlessly connect, access the early years centres. We've only got 4 centres, but they're in 15 communities, and also the 10 children and family centres. The beauty of the children and family centres is that some of those are actually being delivered by Aboriginal medical services, so they've got a different orientation and they're extending and building on that, whereas some are ECEC services that have connected and leveraged. So there's quite a rich and diverse cohort of organisations working together to strengthen the services that are provided. Just a couple of quick things. I know that many of you would know about the AEDI. The good news for Queensland is that more children are developmentally on track now than they were in 2009. So in 2009, there were 29% of kids who were developmentally vulnerable, and in 2012, 26% of kids. Let's hope. And there's been a lot of work that's happened over the last 3 years in Queensland around early childhood strategies and programs to improve kids' health and wellbeing. Let's hope that 2015 sees even more kids developmentally on track next year. I know, I can see. The bad news, and dare I mention it, is that we're still actually faring worse than the rest of Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, again, are more developmentally vulnerable than the average. And just in terms of data, I'm always quite cautious with data. I think you really need to dig down through it, talk about it, look at all the different dimensions and aspects of it. Because if you look at something once, you think, wow, look at that, and you take a reading of it. And then when you unpack it a bit more, you take another reading of it. If you were just to look at this map of Queensland and I were to tell you where it's darkest, those kids are the most developmentally vulnerable. So up around Mornington Island, Dormedji, Karumba, those areas. And then you looked at the southeast and said those kids are faring better. But up in that top corner, there's about 182 kids, and down in the bottom, there's 6,600 vulnerable kids. We need strategies in relation to each of those communities. I probably know all of the people who run the services in that top corner, and we can work with them. The strategies are much more complex and difficult and challenging in the bottom corner.
Okay, are we...
Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. We are still working. I mean, it's a work in progress. It's about building on where we're going. Moving forward, our focus is very intensely on vulnerable and disadvantaged children.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you.
And last of our snapshots, but certainly not least, Roland Simons will go behind all those headlines and drill down on school data, particularly what NAPLAN results are showing us. And Roland is Executive Director, Performance Monitoring and Reporting Branch at the Department of Education. Thanks, Roland.
I'm not going to put up any more slides with large numbers of demographics, thank you. With large numbers of demographic breakdowns and so on, I think you get the idea. But I will give you a bit of a snapshot while the slides are coming up. We've got about 750,000 kids in schooling, primary school to secondary school. We have just under 1,000 kids in homeschooling, for those of you who are interested, and about 6,000 in distance ed. So that's just to give it like a bit of a colouring around the state schooling. We have a lot of data. So if coming back to some of Brian's comments, there is a lot of information here that you can access. It's on our website. So I'll give you a snapshot, about 8 key dimensions of general data, but then there is a lot of breakdown data within that, within schooling. So what are the dimensions? Attendance. Obviously, student attendance rate's about 90%. Obviously, there are high disadvantage or sort of high risk groups, or so you could cut those indicators less than 85% attendance. Thank you very much. So less than 85% attendance is a marker. What are some of the other dimensions? NAPLAN, I'll show you NAPLAN. I'll try and give you a feel for that. Those of you who know NAPLAN probably don't want that done to death. But I do want to give you a bit of a different view on that. School completion rates, Year 12 completions. I'll show you a bit of that as well. School opinion surveys are conducted. There's a national school opinion survey. We're also interested in other indicators of behaviour like short suspensions, long suspensions. Other areas include, I've just gone blank. Some of the other areas include culture surveys that we've got within state schooling, but what I'll do is I'll just come back to the NAPLAN results, really to pick up on what Catherine was talking about. We have improved tremendously, but there's still room to move. So what I'll do is I'll just take you through, for those of you lucky folk who haven't really been exposed to NAPLAN. NAPLAN is done every year 3, 5, 7 and 9. It's largely a census-style test. You can opt out of it. It's done in 5 key areas, so reading, writing, spelling, grammar and punctuation, and numeracy. So that makes 20 areas all up. And this is where it gets really interesting or dull, depending on where you're coming from. We can cut this however you like. So we've got mean scale scores, we've got percentage above a national minimum standard, and we've got bands. So I'll show you the bands, because this is what takes me to my story. So in each of those tests, year 3, 5, 7 and 9, we've got 6 bands. The bottom band of performance is below the national minimum standard. Everything above that is obviously at or above, so the next level up, band 2 on year 3 or band 6 on year 9 is at the national minimum standard, and then above that. All up, they map across a single set of dimensions of 10 bands, which you can see there. And I'll show you the story in a figure in a second, but the story is that the latest set of results we have, and we've just sat the NAPLAN 2014, it's 3 days in May, I should point out, so it's a very small window on a student's ability level, and it's a very small window on the domain of their skills. So when we talk about how are Queensland kids faring, this is just a very, very small snapshot. And so we've seen an area of growth, and that area of growth is unlike any other state and territory. So one of the really positive things coming here is there is something going on here, and I'll show you that right now. But what causes that? And I think that's one of the big questions from a government point of view. Of course, there are some major initiatives we brought in place, like the prep year, and I'll map that for you through the timescale. So what we have through this particular graphic is the Queensland results in the top section and the Australian results in the bottom section, mapped 2008 to 2013 from top to bottom in each of those sections, and then the 6 bands for year 3 reading. So this is year 3 reading. I'm not going to take you through all the 20 areas. You get a sense from me now about how this can be quite a hypnotic process to very little gain. But the story here is a really important one, and you've probably seen it in mean scale score terms, but if we look at the red bands there on at the top for Queensland, you can see from 2008, the proportion of kids below the national minimum standard has moved from 12.9% to 4.9%. The proportion in the top two bands has moved from under 30% to about 40%, sorry. So this pattern of growth across all the bands is a phenomenal story. No other state and territory can point to this. And how do our initiatives map onto that? And the Australian results, Queensland is a part of Australia, so we influence the Australian results. You can see a little bit of a growth there as well. I'd like to think that's Queensland. Queensland full prep year cohort hit the year 3 tests in 2011. There was a half prep year cohort in 2010. There was some movement occurring before that, as you can see, and obviously we'd like to think that we have evolved our systems as well. But is this a prep? Is this something we can directly attribute to prep? Of course we can't say that from causal modelling. It's just not possible for us, but there are a number of initiatives that have fed into this process. Those of you who are looking at that last set there, and this is where we come to, okay, if we compare the Queensland results to Australia, and we come back to Catherine's point, on any measure that we compare there, even in 2013, Queensland is still behind the nation. So we're still trailing. We have moved a substantial distance in terms of where we were starting at, but we still have challenges. We don't have the proportion of kids in the upper bands. We still have more kids in the below national minimum standards. And if you want to break this up, I'm not going to do that at this presentation, I haven't got the time, but if you want to break it up by any of the other stats and any of the other numbers you've seen, Indigenous students, where are Indigenous students? On the mean scale scores, the Indigenous students start at about 2 years behind and they finish by year 9, or even by some of the year 12 indicators, which I'll show you at a high level, about 2 years behind. Some would argue a bit further than that. So these figures belie some of those underlying risk factors that Brian was talking about, but at the same time they show growth. Indigenous students have shown growth at the same rate, and it's almost unfortunate that that's the case, because they're not closing the gap in the way that we would like to see, but they are still growing at the same rate that we're seeing here. So just to bring this into a bit of a sobering point as well, as those year 3 students move to year 5, we would hope to see that transfer of results. And coming back to the point about early intervention, should flow through, should be cheaper, should have long-term benefit. If we look at 2013 there for our year 5 students in reading, we do see a substantial movement. So that is the first full cohort of prep students. We see a little bit of a pattern before them as well. So is this the start of that ongoing trend? We'd like to think so. So this message that I'm trying to share with you in terms of bands hopefully is a little different from what you've seen with regards to NAPLAN results. It is a positive one, it is an optimistic one in that we can get major structural changes, minor changes to show up on these largely intractable measures. So there is hope there, and Queensland is seeing a lot of growth. So I just finished this section on that point that we're still not outpacing the nation in terms of actual point-in-time results, but we definitely are in terms of improvement. So just quickly, some of the other measures, key measures that are worth noting are Year 12 outcomes. And before I show you those, I just want to point out that our retention rates, Year 10 to Year 12, are amongst the best in the states and territories as well. 2013 results here show an 84% retention rate. This is an apparent retention rate. This is mapping the number of kids. We can map real retention rates through state schooling. The rates are lower, but again, show an increase over time in our retention rates. Some of you would argue microeconomic factors would have an impact on that, and I would probably agree with you there as well. Year 12 outcomes, just to give you a general snapshot, also a positive story by and large. We have a range of indicators. There's no single measure, as you probably got that sense from the NAPLAN stuff. There are so many ways we can cut the data. We are not short on single univariate data. We are getting much shorter on multivariate relationships, and causal relationships. We're really in our early days, and I think that comes back to to Brian's point about risk factors. But here again, the overall rates you can see for Queensland students completing Year 12 over time. The number completing Year 12 is going up. These are raw numbers, so you would expect that. The enrolments are going up. Population growth in these areas is increasing. SAT, QCE, IBD and VET qualifications, that's basically a catch-all for the majority of qualifications you leave Year 12 with. QCE, Queensland Certificate of Education, being the main part of that, the next one along. Certificate 2 and Certificate 3 are vocational qualifications to some extent. And I'll just point out here that if we look at our OP results, OP 1 to 15s are increasing, OP 15 to 26s are decreasing, 16 to 25s are decreasing. So what you see there is a shift towards a higher performance, even though there's been a slight decline in the total proportion, total number of students who are OP eligible. For those who are not receiving an OP 1 to 15, there is still an increase in the number of Cert 2s granted, and for those who are also getting an OP 1 to 15 but are also completing a VET qualification or equivalent qualification at Cert 2, you can see it's sort of plateaued a little bit there, but the same results, and I'm running out of time. Finally, SAT. So there are a range of, that's just to give you a feel for the general rate of retention, the rate of completions, the rate of improvement we're seeing in Queensland education by some of these just high-level stats, and it does belie some of the variations that have been talked about by my counterparts about Indigenous and disadvantage. Don't discount any of that. That is directly relevant to what we're looking at here as well. Just finishing on the final slide, which are this is not a story that is completed. If anything, it has just started. We've got a wide range of initiatives. Great Results Guarantee, which is about pushing money out to schools, followed up by Great Teachers, Great Results, which comes back to this notion about the role of the teacher, scaffolding that. Recognising autonomy within schools is a part of this as well, as a part of this current initiative to enact or empower the local stakeholders in this process. Solid Partners, Solid Futures, which is about a four-phase project for Indigenous. So we are trying not to drop the ball, and we're also very interested in these multivariate factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Please put your hands together for Roland.